The rich bride who mocked the poor flower girl until she saw the locket she was wearing. So here is what happened. A wedding, big, expensive, everything perfect. The kind of wedding that costs more money than most people make in 10 years. The bride is dressed like a queen. The guests are all rich. The flowers are all perfect. And there is one little girl, a flower girl, small, quiet, wearing a simple dress. She's just doing her job, dropping petals on the ground before the bride walks. And she makes one small mistake, one tiny mistake, and the bride completely loses it. In front of everyone, she mocks this little girl. She calls her names. She tries to throw her out of the wedding, but there is something around this little girl's neck. A small silver locket. Old, worn out, nothing special to look at. And when that locket falls to the floor and pops open, everything at that wedding stops. The music stops, the guests stop. The bride's own father stops and goes completely pale. Because inside that locket is something that changes every single thing about that day. What is inside the locket? Who is this little girl really? And what happens to the bride when the truth comes out in front of all those people? That is what this story is about. We are not going to tell you the answer right now. You are going to watch it happen scene by scene. And when the moment comes, you will understand why this story is one that stays with you for a long time. Stay right here. This story is just starting. If you believe that cruelty always finds its way back to the person who sends it out, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from today. Now let us begin. Richard Harrove was not born with money. This was important to understand because by the time the story that matters begins, Richard Hargrove was a billionaire. His name was on buildings. His face had been in magazines. His company Harrove Capital and Investments was one of the most successful private equity firms in the country with holdings in real estate, technology infrastructure, pharmaceutical distribution, and agricultural supply chains that together employed over 12,000 people. He was the kind of man that other wealthy men wanted to be photographed standing next to. But Richard Harrove had started with nothing, less than nothing actually, because nothing at least gives you a clean surface to build from. Richard had started with debt. He was born in 1958 in a small town in the Midlands, the third of 5 children of a man named Gerald Harrove who worked at a printing factory and a woman named Edna who cleaned offices at night and took in laundry during the day. The house they lived in was rented. The car Gerald drove was 15 years old. The meals that Edna cooked were designed around what was cheap and filling rather than what anyone preferred to eat. Richard understood from his earliest memory that money was not a neutral subject in his family. It was a presence, a weather condition. It determined what temperature the house was in winter, whether the children had new shoes for school or wore the ones that were already tight, whether there was bread left by Thursday, or whether you made it to Friday on something thinner. He was not angry about this as a child. He was observant. There is a difference. An angry child fights against the condition. An observant child studies it, turns it over, tries to understand the mechanism beneath it. Richard studied the mechanism. He noticed that the families at the end of the road who seemed to have more did not necessarily work harder than his parents. His father worked 10-hour shifts at the factory. His mother worked essentially 2 jobs. The hours they put in were not less than anyone else in the neighborhood, but the families at the end of the road had something different. They had made decisions at some point that compounded. Small decisions, but they had compounded. He was 11 when he first articulated this to himself, not in sophisticated language, in the simple language of an 11-year-old. Some people work for money and some people make money work. He did not know what the second category meant yet, but he wrote it in a notebook he kept under his mattress because he understood that this was the question worth answering. Secondary school was where the separation began. Richard was not the most naturally gifted student in his school. There were boys who absorbed mathematics effortlessly and girls who wrote essays that the English teacher read aloud to the class as examples. Richard was not in those categories, but he had something that the effortlessly gifted students sometimes did not have. He understood that effort was the variable he could control, and he applied it without limit. He stayed after school when teachers were available to ask questions. He read books from the library, not just the required ones, but anything adjacent to what he was studying that might give him a wider framework. He developed the habit which would stay with him for his entire life of writing down every piece of information that seemed important in organized notebooks that he reviewed weekly. He also at 15 got his first job. It was a Saturday job at a hardware shop 2 streets from the school. The owner was a man named Mr. Patterson, a retired builder who had opened the shop as something to do with his retirement, and who had discovered that he was actually good at running it. Mr. Patterson liked Richard because Richard asked questions that showed he was paying attention. Why did some products have higher margins than others? Why did certain times of year produce certain kinds of customers? What was the relationship between the shop's location and its customer profile? Mr. Patterson answered these questions because he found them interesting, and because in 40 years of working, he had rarely been asked them by someone Richard's age. By the time Richard was 17, he was effectively managing the shop on Saturdays. Not because he had been given the title, but because he had developed such a thorough understanding of how it worked that Mr. Patterson trusted his judgment on stock ordering, pricing decisions, and customer relations. When Richard left for university, Mr. Patterson said, "You are going to be either very successful or very dangerous, possibly both." He studied economics at university, not because it was glamorous, but because it was the closest formal discipline to the questions he had been asking since he was 11. He found the theory mostly interesting and occasionally frustrating in the specific way that theory frustrates people who are simultaneously trying to apply it to real situations. The real situation he was applying it to during his university years was a series of small enterprises that he ran alongside his studies. The first was a textbook resale operation. He bought second-hand textbooks cheaply at the end of each academic year, stored them over summer at a cost he had negotiated carefully with a storage facility owner, and sold them at the start of the following year at a price that was lower than the new book price, but higher than what he had paid. The margin was modest, but it was consistent, and it operated while he slept. The second was a note-taking and summary service. He attended lectures thoroughly, produced high-quality organized notes, and sold them to students who had missed lectures or who found his organization more useful than their own. This was more labor-intensive, but the hourly rate it produced was significantly higher than any conventional part-time employment available to students. The third in his final year was more ambitious. He had identified that students at his university had no good source of second-hand furniture when they moved into accommodation, and faced the same problem in reverse when they moved out. He organized a collection service at the end of each academic year, stored the furniture, and sold it to incoming students at the start of the next. He did this in partnership with 2 classmates who provided labor in exchange for shares of the profit. None of these enterprises made him wealthy, but they taught him 3 things that formal education was not teaching: how to identify a gap between what people needed and what was available, how to build a system that operated without requiring his constant direct presence, and how to negotiate. The negotiation skill came from every transaction he made. Buying cheap, selling at the right price, always understanding the other person's position well enough to find the agreement that worked for both sides. He was not a hard negotiator in the aggressive sense. He was a clear one. He understood numbers, and he communicated what he understood directly and honestly, which turned out to be more effective than aggression most of the time. He graduated with a good degree and no clear path. The graduate recruitment programs at large companies wanted people whose profiles matched a template. Richard's profile matched no template. He had run small enterprises and read widely and developed skills that were entirely practical, and that standard graduate assessment processes had no category for. He took a job at a small private equity firm, not a prestigious one, a 12-person operation in a mid-sized city run by a man named Desmond Clark, who had built it from his own savings, and who needed someone who could do analysis, manage relationships, and execute on decisions without requiring elaborate supervision. Richard could do all three. He worked at Clark's firm for 7 years. He learned everything. How to read a balance sheet in the specific way that identified the real health of a business rather than its presented health. How to assess management quality from the way a CEO answered questions they were not expecting. How to structure deals so that the terms protected the investment without alienating the people who would need to execute on it. How to identify sectors that were about to change and position before the change was visible to everyone. He also, in his 3rd year at the firm, met Caroline. Caroline Beaumont was 26 when they met. She was working as a solicitor at a law firm that handled some of Clark's transactions. She was precise and warm in equal measure, the combination that Richard found both intellectually compatible and personally necessary. She had a quality that he had encountered rarely in professional settings. She said what she thought clearly without performing either certainty she did not have or diplomacy she did not feel. He loved her quickly and without complication. For a man who organized everything else in his life with careful deliberation, the feeling about Caroline arrived with none of the usual analysis. It was simply clear. They married 2 years after they met. A small ceremony. Neither of them saw the point in large. They had the same friends at the table as witnesses and went on a modest honeymoon that Caroline had organized because Richard had been in the middle of a transaction and had told her to choose everything and he would show up where she told him to show up. She had chosen well. She always did. Richard left Clark's firm in his 7th year when he was 34 and started Harrow Capital with the capital he had accumulated. A partnership with one investor he had developed a relationship with over several years, and a business plan that was 40 pages and had been rewritten 11 times. The first 5 years were hard. Not in the way that the shelter years of childhood had been hard, where hardness meant genuine scarcity, but hard in the way that building something genuinely hard requires. Constant decisions with incomplete information, frequent wrong turns that cost money and had to be corrected. The specific stress of being responsible for other people's livelihoods when you are also responsible for making the machine that pays those livelihoods actually work. Caroline was with him through all of it, not in the background. Actively. She had left her law firm to join Harrow Capital as its general counsel in year 2, when the transaction volume required someone who could manage legal complexity full-time. She was good at it, better than good. She had a mind that was simultaneously precise about detail and clear about principle, and the combination made her an exceptional lawyer and an exceptional business partner. They also had children. Elena was born in Richard's 36th year when Harrow Capital was beginning to produce real results. She arrived with a quantity of personality that the delivery nurse described somewhat professionally as significant. She was alert from the beginning, demanding, loud in her opinions even before she had the language to express them properly. Richard loved her completely. The love of a parent for a child is not always rational. Elena was not an easy child. She was not a particularly easy teenager, but she was his and Caroline's. And Richard loved her with the specific total commitment of a man who had grown up in scarcity and who had decided that the people he loved would never feel that scarcity. This decision, which came from the best possible place, produced consequences that took years to become fully visible. He gave Elena everything. The best schools, the best holidays, the best clothes, the access to his world that came from being Richard Harrow's daughter, which meant rooms where people paid attention when you entered and doors that opened before you needed to knock. He gave her these things because he had not had them and he understood their value, and he wanted her to have what value they could provide. What he did not give her, not because he did not want to, but because he did not know how, was the experience of what their absence felt like. The specific education of not having, of counting, of understanding that things cost something and that cost is real. Elena never received this. Every cost was invisible to her because every cost was paid before she encountered it. The result was a young woman who was genuinely intelligent. She had both her parents' minds properly inherited and genuinely capable in many ways, and who had also developed through years of never encountering resistance, a sense that the world was organized around her preferences. She was not cruel in the way of people who enjoy cruelty. She was cruel in the way of people who have never been required to consider that their preferences have costs for other people. This is a different kind of cruelty. It is in some ways more difficult to correct because it is not mean-spirited. It is simply unaware. Alina was unaware. For a long time, this did not cause visible damage. The world she moved in was the world of people who could accommodate her preferences without much cost to themselves. Her school was full of children from similar backgrounds. Her social world was full of people who understood implicitly the specific economy of wealthy young women's social dynamics. It was only when Alina began to interact with the wider world with people who had different circumstances and different positions that the damage became visible. And the most visible it ever became was on her wedding day. But before the wedding, there is another story. There is the story of a woman named Catherine, and you need to know it completely before the wedding makes sense. Stay with us because what comes next is the part that explains everything. Richard Harrove had a sister. This was not widely known, not because he actively hid it, but because the silence between them had lasted long enough that it had become its own kind of truth. When people who knew Richard thought about his family, they thought about Caroline, about Alina. They did not think about Catherine because Catherine had not been in the picture for 23 years. Catherine Hargrove was 4 years older than Richard. She was the eldest of the 5 children who had grown up in the rented house with Gerald and Edna. And she had the specific quality of eldest children who grow up in scarcity, a protectiveness that ran so deep it had become structural, a habit of absorbing difficulties before they reached the younger ones, a kind of love that expressed itself through management rather than declaration. She and Richard had been close in the way of siblings who have shared the specific conditions of their childhood, not the easy closeness of children who have nothing to navigate together, but the deeper, more complex closeness of children who have navigated real things and understand each other because of what they have shared. Catherine had not gone to university. The family had no money for it when she finished school, and the scholarship she had applied for had not come through. And by the time the following year arrived, the specific window for that particular path had closed in the way that windows close in families where the margin is thin. She had worked office work initially, the kind of work that was available to someone with her qualifications and no degree. She was organized and capable, and people who worked with her quickly understood that she was more capable than her title suggested. She moved up steadily, not dramatically, through a series of office management and administrative roles that gave her real competence in how organizations functioned, even if they did not give her the formal recognition that university graduates received. She was 29 when she met Thomas. Thomas Webb was an English teacher at a secondary school in the town where Catherine was living. He was not wealthy. He would never be wealthy. He was a man who had chosen teaching specifically because he believed it was the most important thing he could do with his time. And he had made this choice with a clear understanding of what it would cost him financially and no regret about the cost. He was kind in the specific way of people who are kind because they have thought about it and decided it is right, not because they are easy or undemanding. He was funny in the dry way of people who have read widely and noticed the absurdity in ordinary situations. He was committed to Catherine in the complete way of someone who has found the person they were looking for and has no interest in looking elsewhere. Catherine loved him. She loved him with the directness of a woman who had spent her 20s building practical skills and had not had the luxury of extended romantic confusion. She knew what she felt, and she said so, and she committed to it without the usual protective hedging of people who have not yet decided what they want. They married when she was 31, a simple ceremony. They could not afford large. Thomas's mother and his 2 brothers attended. Catherine's family attended. Gerald and Edna and the younger siblings, including Richard, who was 27 and already at Clark's firm, and who liked Thomas immediately in the way that Richard liked people who said what they thought without decoration. Richard gave a speech at the wedding that made Catherine cry and Thomas laugh, and made the older guests exchange the specific look of people watching something that is genuinely good. After the wedding, Catherine and Thomas moved to a different town. Thomas had taken a position at a school that was a better fit, and that paid slightly more, and they had found a flat they could afford, and they were building the specific small life of two people who are content with its size because of who they are building it with. Richard and Catherine stayed in contact, regular calls, occasional visits. They were close in the practical way of adult siblings who have lives that do not often overlap geographically, but who maintain the connection because it matters to both of them. This was the state of things when their father Gerald died. Gerald Hargrove died in 2003, a quiet death in a hospital after a short illness that had given him and Edna very little time to prepare for it. He was 67. Richard and all the siblings came for the funeral. It was a difficult time in the specific way that the death of a parent is difficult, a particular kind of rearrangement of the world's furniture that takes time to get used to. During the period after the funeral, while the family was still gathered, a conversation happened. Richard had by this point been running Harrow Capital for 6 years. The business was successful in a way that had become substantial. He had made money that had compounded in the way that he had observed money compounding when he was 11. And the result was that Richard Harrow was now genuinely wealthy. He had also developed over those 6 years certain ideas about wealth and how it should be managed. Not ideas he had arrived at by thinking abstractly, but ideas that had come from watching what wealth did to people and what people did with wealth. He had seen businesses fail because the people who built them had brought their families into them inappropriately, blurring the line between the enterprise and the personal in ways that damaged both. He had seen family money become the source of the family's undoing when it was distributed without structure. He had also, if he was honest, developed a concern about Thomas. Thomas Webb was an excellent man. Richard knew this. He was kind and intelligent and genuinely good. And he was an excellent teacher who had the respect of his students and colleagues. He was also entirely without financial ambition. He had never shown any interest in building anything beyond the classroom. He did not invest. He did not save strategically. He was not bad with money in the sense of being irresponsible. He simply did not think about it the way Richard thought about it and never would. Richard had begun to feel over the years since Catherine's marriage that Catherine had made a choice that would limit her permanently. That Thomas was a kind man whose kindness would not protect her from the financial vulnerability of a life built on a teacher's salary with no accumulation. He raised this with Catherine during the family gathering after Gerald's funeral. He did not raise it well. He said things that were true in a factual sense, but that came from a place that had more to do with his own framework than with Catherine's. He talked about financial security. He talked about planning. He talked about what Thomas would be able to provide in 20 years, in 30 years. Catherine listened. Then she said, "I did not choose Thomas for what he would provide. I chose him because I love him and because he is good. Those things do not change because they do not accumulate." Richard said, "I'm not criticizing your love. I'm talking about practical reality." Catherine said, "The practical reality is that I am happy. That is not a small thing." Richard said something about happiness and security being different categories, and the conversation went to a place that it should not have gone, and words were said on both sides that had been sitting under the surface for longer than anyone had acknowledged. The specific thing that broke it was when Richard said, with the impatience of a man who was used to his analysis being correct, "You have made a choice that means your children will have less than they could have had." Catherine looked at him for a long time after that. She said, "My children will have a father who comes home every evening and who knows their names and who chose them over everything else. That is what I wanted for them. And if you cannot see that as enough, then this conversation is finished." It was finished. Not the relationship, not yet. But something had cracked that did not fully heal. And in the months after Gerald's funeral, the contact between them became less frequent, and then occasional. And then one year, Catherine and Thomas moved again for another teaching position. And somehow in the moving and the business and the mutual pride that prevented either of them from making the first repair, The contact stopped entirely. Richard had also, in the period after this conversation, made a decision about his will and his estate planning that formalized what had broken between them. He did not cut Catherine off with anger. He simply reorganized his estate in a way that did not include her, with a justification rooted in his own framework about what families did and did not provide for each other. He told himself he had done nothing wrong. He had been honest about his concerns. She had disagreed. She had her life. He had his. They were adults. What he did not fully acknowledge in the years that followed was how much he missed her. It lived in him as a background noise rather than a clear pain, something he had learned to move around rather than through. And Caroline, who had known Catherine before the distance settled, and who had always liked her with the direct warmth of someone who recognizes genuine character, said to Richard once in a quiet evening at home, "I think you should call her." Richard said, "She knows where I am." Caroline said, "That is not the same thing." He knew she was right. He did not call. Catherine, in the years of silence, lived. She and Thomas had moved to a town 3 hours from London, a smaller place where the school Thomas taught at was the kind of school that needed good teachers and paid them modestly, and where the students arrived with more difficulties than the students at the more comfortable schools Richard's own children attended. They had one child. Her name was Ma. Mia was born in 2005 when Catherine was 41. A late child, unexpected in the timing, if not in the desire, and received by both parents with a particular completeness of love. Catherine had not been sure in her 30s that children would happen. The years had passed, and the question had remained open, and she had learned to hold it without pain. When Myra arrived, she was small and quiet, and had Catherine's eyes and Thomas's manner of paying attention to things. She was the kind of child that adults described as an old soul, which is what adults say about children whose attentiveness makes them seem further along than their years. They raised her in a house that was modest and warm. Thomas taught Catherine worked part-time at the school as an administrator, which meant they could both be present for Ma in ways that mattered to them more than anything they might have had in exchange for being elsewhere. They had no extra money. Holidays were local or not at all. Clothes were chosen for durability and fit rather than name. The house had good books and a kitchen that always smelled of something being cooked, and a garden that Thomas tended on weekends with the specific pleasure of someone who finds gardening genuinely restorative. Mia grew up knowing that her family did not have much money. She knew this the way children know things that are simply part of the landscape of their lives without drama or resentment. She also knew that the house was full of warmth, and that her parents thought she was the most important person in the world, and that her father could name every bird that came to the garden feeder, and that her mother made soup on Sunday evenings. That was the best thing she had ever tasted. She wore a locket. It was silver, old and worn, a small heart-shaped thing that had been given to Catherine by their mother, Edna, before Edna died. Inside the locket was a photograph. The photograph was small and slightly faded but clear enough. A young woman in her 20s smiling her arm around a man. The woman looked like Catherine and also like someone else. Catherine had told Mia when Mia was old enough to ask that the locket had belonged to her grandmother, and that it was the most precious thing she owned, and that Mia could wear it but should take care of it. Mia wore it every day. She wore it on the morning of the wedding. Thomas had been ill for 3 years by then, not terminally, but seriously, a condition that had required treatment that was expensive and ongoing, and that had changed the mathematics of their already thin budget in ways that could not be fully absorbed. Catherine had taken on additional work wherever she could find it. She had taken a position at the venue where the wedding was being held, working in the kitchen and serving function, because the money was regular, and the hours were flexible enough to manage alongside caring for Thomas. She had not known when she applied for the work at the venue whose wedding was booked there. She had found out only when she saw the name on the function sheet. Harrow. She had stood in the kitchen of the catering company function sheet in her hand and looked at the name for a long time. She had not said anything to anyone. She had gone home and told Thomas. Thomas had said, "Do you want to go?" Catherine had said, "I need the money." Thomas had said, "That is not what I asked." She had thought about it. She had said, "Yes, I think I do want to go, not to make trouble, just to see." Maya had been asked to be a flower girl because one of the venue staff had noticed her, and the wedding coordinator had been short one child, and Mia had the right look, small and quiet and careful. And Catherine had said yes because the small payment that came with it would help. She had not known how central Mia would become to the day. She would find out. Keep watching because the wedding is about to begin, and nothing about it will go the way anyone planned. If this story is hitting something real for you, subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub right now. Hit the bell. What comes next is worth being here for. The wedding was on a Saturday in September. The venue was a country house hotel that had been converted from an 18th century estate, the kind of place that rented exclusively for private events and whose prices made the sort of statement that Elena Hargrove intended to make. Every room was dressed in ivory and gold. The floral arrangements had been designed by someone whose name was known in the industry and whose minimum booking fee could have paid 3 months of the wage Catherine was earning in the kitchen downstairs. Elena had been planning this wedding for 14 months, not because she was particularly romantic about weddings, though she was not opposed to romance, but because the wedding was a statement. It was the statement of Elena Hargrove, daughter of Richard Hargrove, one of the most successful private equity investors in the country, stepping formally and publicly into the next phase of her life. The guest list was 340 people. The menu had been redesigned twice. The dress had been made by a woman in Milan whose other clients included people whose faces appeared in magazines without permission being required. The groom was Marcus Pendleton. Marcus was 32, 4 years older than Elena. He came from a family that was comfortable rather than wealthy. The son of a solicitor and a secondary school headmistress, both of whom had given their children a stable and considered upbringing that Marcus carried with him in the specific way of someone who was genuinely at ease with most kinds of people. He was a civil engineer who ran his own consultancy, self-made in a modest way, with the quiet confidence of someone who builds things and has developed trust in his own competence through the actual building. He loved Elena genuinely in the complicated way that people love someone who is both wonderful and difficult, who has qualities that illuminate a room and habits that make inhabiting the room alongside her occasionally exhausting. He had loved her for 3 years and had proposed with a ring he had chosen himself after 2 weeks of looking, and when she had accepted, he had felt the specific clarity of a person who has made the right decision. He was less clear on the morning of the wedding about certain things. He stood in the room that the venue had set aside for the groom and his groomsmen, 2 of his closest friends from university. And he was doing the specific thing that grooms do while waiting, which is either talking too much or saying very little. And Marcus was saying very little. His best man, a man named James who had known him for 15 years and who read situations accurately, said, "Are you all right?" Marcus said, "Yes." James said, "That was not convincing." Marcus said, "I love her." James said, "I know that was not what I asked." A pause. Marcus said she had the phone call yesterday with the coordinator about the flower girls. James waited. Marcus said, "I heard her on the call. She was talking about one of the children, about what the child was wearing and whether it was appropriate for the aesthetic." Another pause. Marcus said the child is 7 years old. James did not say anything. Marcus said, "I know she is under a lot of pressure. 14 months of planning. I know that makes people different." James said yes. The conversation closed, but the unease that had prompted it did not close. It sat in the room alongside Marcus and his 2 groomsmen, and the morning light coming through the tall windows of the estate. And Marcus stood in it and breathed through it and told himself that the day was going to be fine. Downstairs in the wing of the venue where the wedding party was assembling, Elena was not fine, not because of Marcus. She was certain about Marcus. He was the right person for her life, and she knew it in the way she knew most things quickly, and with a high degree of confidence. She was not fine because the flower arrangement on the 3rd table on the east side of the reception room was slightly asymmetrical, and she had told the florist specifically. And when she had pointed it out this morning, the florist had said she would see what she could do, and Elena had taken see what she could do to mean it would be fixed, and it was not yet fixed. She was also not fine because one of the bridesmaids had a hair situation that was not what had been agreed, and the photographer had arrived 12 minutes late, and the 12 minutes bothered her even though they had caught up. And the wedding coordinator, a very capable woman named Sarah, had made the mistake of telling Elena about a small issue with the catering that had already been resolved rather than simply resolving it without Elena knowing. Elena was operating at the specific frequency of a person for whom every deviation from the plan was a threat to something larger than the deviation itself. The plan was the expression of 14 months of her attention and judgment and care, and every deviation was therefore a statement about whether her attention and judgment and care were respected. She was in this state, wound-tight, and moving fast through the various preceremony logistics. When she came through the eastern corridor of the venue and encountered the children, there were 4 flower girls. 3 of them were the daughters of guests, small girls in matching ivory dresses with gold sashes that Elena had selected and purchased and arranged for delivery to each family 6 weeks prior. They were standing in a neat group near the corridor entrance, their dresses immaculate, their hair organized, looking like exactly what Elena had planned. The 4th flower girl was Maya. Mia was standing slightly apart from the other 3, not unfriendly, just with the specific self-containment of a child who did not know these particular children and was uncertain of the social dynamics. She was wearing a dress that was clean and neat and clearly carefully pressed by someone who had done their best with what they had. It was not the ivory dress with the gold sash. It was a white dress with small yellow flowers on it that had been Mia's best dress for 2 years, and that Catherine had pressed twice the night before. The coordinator, Sarah, had provided Mia's name to the seamstress who was managing the flower girl's clothing, but the communication had somehow not completed before Mia arrived, and so Mia was wearing her own dress rather than the one that matched the others. Sarah was in the process of explaining this to her assistant when Elena came around the corner. Elena stopped. She looked at the 4 children. Her eyes moved to Maya. The dress was wrong. This was the first thing Elena registered. The dress was wrong and it would be in the photographs, and the photographs were permanent. The practical calculation happened in the first 2 seconds. What happened in the next several seconds was different. Elena walked to where Mia was standing. Mia looked up. She was small for her age, 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and the locket around her neck and a basket of flower petals in her hands. Elena said, "Where is your proper dress?" Maya looked at her. Children understand tone before they understand all the words. She understood that this was not a warm question. Maya said, "This is my dress." Elena said, "This is not what was arranged." Sarah appeared at Elena's shoulder. She said, "Miss Harrow, the mix-up was on our side. We are sorting it." Elena said, "This is not sorted. Look at her." The corridor was not empty. 2 of the groomsmen were passing. A photographer's assistant was nearby. 3 of the venue staff could see from their positions what was happening. The other 3 flower girls were watching with the wide eyes of small children who understand that something uncomfortable is happening without understanding exactly what. Maya was standing completely still. Her hands had tightened around the basket. Elena said, "Where did you find her? She looks like she's dressed for a completely different event. This is supposed to be." She stopped herself. She looked at Sarah. "What is her name?" Sarah said, "Maya and her mother is Elena cut across. This is a 340-person wedding that has been planned for 14 months. Every single element has been thought about, every detail, and she is going to be in the photographs." Maya said quietly, "I'm sorry about the dress. My mom pressed it twice." Something in the way the child said it, the complete guileless directness, the mention of her mother pressing the dress twice, should have stopped the moment. In a different register, Elena might have heard it and caught herself. She did not catch herself. She said, "I'm sure she did. I'm sure she did the very best she could with what she has, which is clearly not much." There was a silence in the corridor. The photographer's assistant had stopped pretending to be doing something else. One of the groomsmen had paused in the doorway. Maya was looking at Elena with the specific expression of a child who does not fully understand what has been said, but understands that it was not kind. Elena said, I'm going to need her removed from the ceremony. Sarah, get the coordinator to sort out the photographs without her. She can stay in the back if she wants, but she is not going to be in the processional." She turned and walked away. Maya stood in the corridor. The other 3 flower girls were looking at her. The oldest one, a girl of 9 named Sophie, whose parents were family friends of the Hargroves, reached over and touched Mia's hand. She did not say anything. She just touched her hand. Mia did not cry yet. She held the basket of petals and looked at the door that Alina had gone through and held everything together with the specific interior effort of a child who has been made to feel small and who has not yet decided what to do with that feeling. What happened next happened in 2 places at once. In the kitchen downstairs, Catherine was working. She was a practical woman, and she had organized herself that morning with the economy of someone who understood that the day required function over feeling. She had helped Mira into her dress. She had pressed the locket around Maya's neck and said, "Wear this today. It is your good luck." She had walked with Mia to the venue coordinator and handed her over and gone to the kitchen to begin her work. She did not know what was happening in the corridor above. She found out when Sarah came into the kitchen quickly with the expression of someone managing a situation that had become more complicated than expected. Sarah said, "Mrs. Webb, I need to tell you something about Maya." Catherine turned. Sarah explained efficiently and with genuine concern what had happened. Catherine listened to all of it without expression. Then she removed her apron, set it on the counter, and walked to the door. Sarah said, "Mrs. Webb, I need to ask you to think carefully." Catherine said, "I know what I'm doing." She walked upstairs. Mia was still in the corridor when Catherine found her, though Sar's assistant had moved her to a small alcove near the side entrance where she was less visible. The other flower girls had been taken to wait in the ante-room. Mia was sitting on a chair that was too big for her, her feet not quite reaching the floor, her basket of petals on her lap. When she saw Catherine, she got down from the chair and came across the corridor quickly, and Catherine knelt and held her. And Maya did not cry even then, but pressed her face into Catherine's shoulder and stayed there. Catherine held her. She kept her face turned away from the young venue assistant who was hovering nearby because she did not want the assistant to see her own expression, which she was not certain she could control. After a moment, she straightened. She said to Maya, "Are you all right?" Maya said, "She said we don't have much." Catherine looked at her. She said, "That is true, we do not have much money." Maya said she said it like it was bad. Catherine said some people confuse the amount of money a person has with the amount they are worth. They are not the same thing. Maya said, "I know." Catherine said, "I know, you know." A pause. Maya said she was very mean. Catherine said, "Yes, she was." Another pause. Maya said, "Are we going home?" Catherine thought about this. The practical reality was that she needed the income from today. The moral reality was that what had just happened was not acceptable. The personal reality was that upstairs on the floor above her, her brother Richard was about to walk his daughter down the aisle. Her brother Richard, who she had not spoken to in 23 years, she said to Mia, "Not yet. Stay here for a little while. I am going to talk to someone." She stood and walked toward the stairs. She was not sure what she intended to say. She was not sure that she intended to say anything to Richard. She was not sure he would even recognize her after 23 years. What she was sure of was that she was going to find out. Do not go anywhere because the next part is where everything in this story comes together. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin at 2:00. At 1:45, the guests were mostly seated. 340 people arranged in rows in the great hall of the estate, an enormous room with high ceilings and tall windows, and the kind of acoustic quality that made even quiet sounds carry. The string quartet in the corner was playing the agreed preceremony music. The floral arrangements were in place, including the third table on the east side, which Sarah had managed to have corrected without Alina noticing the correction had been necessary. Marcus was at the front of the room with James and his other groomsmen, standing with the composed stillness of someone who is managing their internal state actively. He was looking at the door through which Alina would come. He was also aware in the peripheral way of someone who is paying attention to the whole room, while focusing on one specific point, that there was some kind of quiet activity happening near the side entrance. He could see Sarah moving quickly in a way that suggested management of something unplanned. He could not see what the something was. What the something was. Maya had been inside the side alcove since Catherine had gone to find someone to speak to. She was still holding her basket of flower petals because nobody had told her to put it down, and she had decided to keep it because it gave her hands something to do. She was watching the guests through the doorway that gave a partial view of the hall, watching the way people dressed in very expensive things move to their seats. She had the locket in her hand, not around her neck. She had taken it off, which she did not usually do, but the clasp had been bothering her all morning. And she had opened it to look at the photograph inside the way she sometimes did when she was thinking, the way other children might look at a familiar book. She was looking at the photograph when Alina came through the side entrance. Alina had not intended to come through the side entrance. She had been moving through the venue, checking things, and had taken this route because it was faster than the main corridor at this point in the day. She was not looking for Maya. She had dealt with the Maya situation and had moved past it. But she came through the door and Mia was there. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Alina had calmed slightly from the corridor encounter. The ceremony was minutes away, and the ceremonial momentum of the day was pulling her into a different register. She looked at the child sitting in the alcove with the flower basket and the open locket in her small hands, and felt the first small movement of something that might have become regret if she had let it. She did not let it. She said, "Why are you still here?" Maya said. "My mom said to wait." Alina said, "Well, your mom should take you home. This is not." She stopped. She had seen the locket, not the locket specifically, the photograph inside the locket. She stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked at the photograph in Mia's open hand, and something went through her face that was not any of the expressions that had been on it all morning. Not impatience or irritation or the managed performance of bridal composure. Something genuine and confused and alarmed, she said, and her voice was different. "What is that?" Mia looked at the locket. She said, "My locket." Alina said, "The photograph inside it. Who is that?" Maya looked at the photograph. She said, "I don't know her name. My mom says it's my grandmother or someone. She gave the locket to my mom." Alina said, "Let me see it." Maya hesitated. Then she held it out. Alina took it. She looked at the photograph. She had never seen this photograph before. She had never seen this specific image. But the face in it was familiar in a way that went past familiarity into something deeper, something almost biological. The face was like looking at herself in a mirror that had been adjusted, showing a version that was kinder around the eyes and softer around the mouth, but structurally bone deep, the same. She was still looking at it when the locket fell. She had not held it carefully enough. Her fingers were not secure around the small worn clasp, and it slipped and hit the stone floor of the alcove with a sound that was small but clear. Both of them looked at it on the floor. Mia reached for it. As she did, she knocked the flower basket and petals scattered across the floor. The white petals spreading out around the fallen locket, and the movement caused a cascade, and Mia's small hand reached for the locket. And in the reaching, she was off balance and she went down on her knee, and Alina reflexively stepped back, and the movement brought her around the corner of the alcove doorway and into the partial view of the hall where Richard Harrow saw her. Not Alina, he saw Mur on the floor reaching for something. He saw petals scattered. He was standing at the side of the hall near the family entrance preparing to take his place to walk Alina down the aisle, and he had come a different route than expected, and he was looking at this small child on the floor among scattered petals. He started to step forward to help, which was the instinctive response of a man who was also a parent, and then he saw what Mia was picking up. The locket. He saw the locket in Mia's small hands. He saw her hold it up to check the clasp was intact. He saw the worn silver heart shape of it, the specific size and design that he had not seen for 23 years, but that he recognized the way you recognize things that have been stored in the deepest part of memory, not with the mind, but with something older. He crossed the space between them in a movement that was not graceful but was direct. He said, "Wait." Maya looked up at him. She had never seen this man before. He was in his 60s, tall, well-dressed in the way of the wedding with the bearing of someone that rooms organized around. His expression was not unkind. It was something she did not have a word for. He said quietly, "May I see that?" She looked at him. She said, "It belongs to my mom." He said, I know, I think I know, can I see it for just a moment? She held it out. He took it. He looked at it. He opened it. The photograph inside was small and faded but clear enough. A young woman in her early 20s, smiling, her arm around a man. The young woman looked like Catherine. She looked also like Alina. She looked like a version of the woman who might have existed if you combined both of them, the specific genetic echo that family resemblance carries through time. Richard Hargrave looked at the photograph. For a long time, when he looked up, Catherine was standing in the doorway of the alcove. He had not heard her come. He did not know how long she had been there. She was wearing the practical clothes of the kitchen staff, an apron still visible at the side where she had not fully removed it in her speed of movement. And she was looking at him with the expression of someone who has been preparing for a moment and has found that preparation was not sufficient. He looked at her. He said her name. He said Catherine. She did not move. He said, you are here. She said, yes, sir. He said, why didn't you? She said, I didn't know it was your wedding until I saw the function sheet. I needed the work. He looked at her, then at Maya, then back at Catherine. He said, this is your daughter. Catherine said, yes, her name is Maya. He looked at Maya. Maya looked at him. He said, how old is she? Catherine said, she is 7. He was quiet. He said, and Thomas, Catherine said, he is ill. He is getting better, but it has been a difficult 3 years. He said, why didn't you call me? The question came out with something in it that was not accusation. It was the question of someone who is only now understanding the full dimension of what the silence had contained. Catherine said, you made your position clear. He said, I was wrong. This was not a planned thing. It was not a prepared speech or a managed communication. It came out simply, the way simple true things come out when a person has been carrying them too long, and the moment becomes more real than the carrying. He said, I was wrong about a great many things, and I think I am about to find out that I have been wrong about more. He looked toward the hole. Alina was standing at the edge of the alcove doorway. She had heard everything. Her expression had gone through several things since seeing the Locket photograph, and had arrived at something that had no good name, but that was somewhere in the territory of a person who is understanding that the ground beneath them has shifted, and the shift is permanent. Richard looked at his daughter. He said, Alina. She said nothing. He said, I think we need to have a conversation before this ceremony right now. Alina said, Papa, we are 7 minutes from. He said, I know what time it is. We need to talk. Sarah, who had appeared at the edge of the corridor with the expression of a wedding coordinator who is managing a situation that no professional training has fully prepared her for, said, Mr. Harrove, the ceremony is. Richard said, please tell the guests there will be a brief delay. Sor said, a delay? Richard said, please. He said it with the specific quality of a request from a man who does not often make requests, and Sarah heard it and went to do what he had asked. Richard turned to Catherine. He said, please come inside, all of you. We need to talk in the same room. Catherine looked at him. She said, Richard. He said, I know. I know it is too late for a great many things, but for some things it is not too late. He held out his hand. After a moment, Catherine took it. They went inside. Stay right here because the conversation that happened in the next 20 minutes is one of the most important in this story, and you need to hear every word of it. This is also a good moment to subscribe if you haven't. Hit that bell. The ending is coming and it is worth being here for. The room they used was the estate's small library adjacent to the main hall. It was a well-appointed room with shelves of books that were genuine rather than decorative, and a fireplace that was not lit at this time of year, and chairs arranged for sitting rather than show. A practical human room in a building that was otherwise performing grandeur. Richard sat in one of the chairs. Ma sat on Catherine's lap. Alina stood near the door. She was still in her wedding dress, which under other circumstances would have been the most important thing about the image. It was not the most important thing about the image. Marcus was also present. He had not been invited into the conversation. He had simply appeared at the door of the library when the delay was announced, because Marcus Pendleton was the kind of person who moved toward things that mattered rather than waiting to be told what was happening. And when he had seen Richard's face as he moved across the hall, he had understood that whatever was happening was something Richard should not be navigating alone. He stood at the back of the room near the door and said nothing. And Richard acknowledged him with a look that communicated both that his presence was noticed and that it was welcome. Richard looked at Alina. He said, "I need to tell you something that I should have told you a long time ago. And before I tell you, I want you to understand that what I am about to say is not about blame. It is about truth that has been missing." Alina looked at her father. Her expression was complicated. She had been in the state of high-maintained performance for 14 months, and the mechanism of it was very resistant to being suspended. But the locket and the photograph and the woman sitting with the child and her father's expression were together, producing a pressure on the mechanism that was overcoming the resistance. She said, "All right." He said, "You have a family you didn't know about." A silence. He said, "When I was young, before your mother, before any of this, I had a sister. Her name is Catherine. You have never met her because 23 years ago we had an argument about a decision she made, and I handled the argument badly and the distance grew and I did not repair it when I should have." Alina looked at Catherine was looking at Richard. Alina said, "A sister." Richard said, "Yes." Alina said, "And the girl," he said, "Catherine's daughter, your cousin." Alina looked at Maya looked at Alina. Mia's expression throughout this whole conversation had been the expression of a child who is absorbing a great deal of information and is going to have questions about it for a long time, but who is for the moment simply receiving. Alina said, "And the locket." Richard said, "The locket was given to Catherine by our mother. I remember it. I remember the day she gave it. Catherine must have been 19 and mother gave it to her because she said Catherine would need it more than the rest of us, which was mother's way of saying that she saw something in Catherine that needed protecting." Catherine made a sound that was not quite speech. Richard turned to her. He said, "I am sorry. I'm going to say that clearly because I have been not saying it for 23 years and I understand now what that cost. I was wrong about Thomas. I was wrong about the choices you made. I was protecting something in myself that I called analysis, and that was actually fear. And I pointed it at your life and your choices and your husband, and I was wrong." Catherine was looking at him. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has been presented with the possibility of putting it down, but is not yet certain the floor will hold the weight. She said, "Thomas is good." Richard said, "I know." She said, "He has been good for 23 years. Richard said, "I know." She said, "And he is ill now and it has been very difficult and the money has been." Her voice stopped it. Richard said, "I know." She said, "You don't know. You haven't been there." He said, "No, I haven't. And that is the thing I cannot undo. I can only do now what I can do now." A long silence. Maya said into the silence with the complete directness of a 7-year-old who has been following the conversation as closely as she could, "Are you my uncle?" The room did something when she said it. It did not change materially, but it shifted. Something in the temperature of it shifted. Richard looked at her. He said, "Yes, I believe I am." Maya considered this. She said, "My dad has a lot of uncles. He says uncles are good if they show up." A pause. Richard said, "Your dad sounds like a smart man." Maya said, "He is. He knows every bird that comes to the garden feeder." Richard looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at Richard. There was a great deal in the exchange that was not spoken. 23 years of not spoken things, and also something that was newer and less complicated. Two people who had been siblings for the first 30 years of their lives and who had never fully stopped being siblings even during the years. The silence made it invisible. Richard said, "Can we start?" Catherine said. "You mean again?" He said, "I mean again." She was quiet. She said Thomas would have to decide. He said, "Of course." She said, "He doesn't hold grudges. He isn't built that way." He said, "Then maybe he can be a model for me." Another silence, smaller this time, more navigable. Catherine said, "Maybe." It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness was going to be a process rather than a moment. And both of them understood this because they were practical people who had learned that the significant things in life were almost never moments. They were processes. But it was the beginning of a process which was the most that could happen in a library with a wedding ceremony waiting in the next room. Richard turned to Alina. This was the part that had to happen and that he had not yet addressed. He said, "I need to talk to you about this morning." Alina looked at him. She said, "Papa," he said, "I am not going to shout. I am not going to make a scene at your wedding, but I need you to hear me." She waited. He said, "What you did in that corridor this morning." She said, I was under a lot of pressure and the situation with the dress was. He said, Alina, she stopped. He said, I am not asking you to explain it. I am asking you to hear me when I tell you that what you said to this child in front of people in that corridor was cruel. Alina looked at Ma. Something was happening in Alina's face. It was not a quick process. It was the specific slow movement of a person who has been operating inside a framework that made their actions seem reasonable, and who is encountering for the first time with full force the view from outside the framework. She said, I know her dress was wrong. He said the dress was not the issue and you know it. She was quiet. He said she told you her mother pressed it twice. She is 7 years old and she told you her mother pressed her best dress twice for your wedding, and you told her it was clearly not much. The room was silent. Alina said nothing. Richard said, that is who I raised Alina. That is what 14 months of a wedding and a life of having everything without ever having to think about what having everything costs has produced. And I am not saying it to hurt you. I am saying it because you are the person I love most in this world. And if I do not say it today, I will have failed you the same way I failed your aunt. He stopped her. He said, by not saying the true thing when it needed to be said. Lena looked at her father. She looked at Catherine. She looked at Maya. Mia was looking at her with the uncomplicated attention of a child who has no pretense to hide behind. Alina said, and her voice was different from every version of her voice that the day had so far produced, I'm sorry to both of you. It was not a long apology. It was not elaborate or eloquent, but it was said directly looking at the people it was addressed to without management or performance. Maya considered it. She said, okay. Catherine looked at her daughter with the expression of a mother who is watching her child be more generous than the situation required and who loves her entirely for it. Marcus, from his position near the door, said nothing, but he moved his weight in a way that communicated something to anyone watching. A settling, a relaxing of the specific tension he had been carrying since the morning. Richard stirred it. He said, there is a wedding waiting. He said this to Alina specifically, but with a quality that extended it to everyone in the room. Then he said, and after the wedding there are things that need to be arranged, practical things. I'm not going to do them in front of anyone today, but they will be done. Catherine said, Richard, you don't need to. He said, Thomas needs proper medical care. You need proper income. Maya needs a school that has what she should have. These are not charity. These are 23 years of interest on something I owe you. Catherine looked at him. She said, I did not come here for money. He said, I know you didn't, which is partly why I know you deserve it. Another silence. He said, Catherine, I am asking you to let me try to be a brother again, not perfectly. I have not been practicing for 23 years, but trying. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Thomas will have questions. He said, tell him I will answer everyone. She said, he will probably ask about birds. A pause. Richard said, then I will learn about birds. Catherine looked at him. Something happened in her face that was small but absolute. A specific quality of resistance releasing. Not all of it, not the part that was wise to keep, just the part that was making her grip a wound for protection instead of for purpose. She said, all right. Richard nodded. He said, shall we have a wedding? The ceremony happened. It was not what anyone had planned, which is often how the ceremonies that matter most work. It was not the perfectly managed event of 14 months of planning. It was something slightly less ordered and considerably more real. Alina walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and she looked different than she had looked an hour before. Not in the dress or the hair or the external things, in the specific quality of her face. Something that had been tightly held was slightly less tight. The room noticed it without knowing what they were noticing. Marcus noticed it specifically. He watched her come toward him, and his face did the thing that faces do when you see the person you love being genuinely themselves. The thing that is not about the dress or the occasion, but about the actual person, and he took her hand when she arrived and pressed it in the way that said, I see you. She pressed back. Maya was in the ceremony. She walked at the front with the other flower girls, her basket of petals in her hand, her dress still the dress with the yellow flowers that her mother had pressed twice. And she scattered the petals with the serious attention of someone who is doing something that matters. No one in the room who saw her thought about the dress. Catherine watched from the side. She had an apron in her pocket that she was no longer wearing and a locket around her neck because Mia had given it back to her before the ceremony began and said, "You should wear it today. It is your good luck." Richard saw Catherine watching from the side. He caught her eye once during the ceremony. He did not wave or gesture. He simply looked at her for a moment with the look of a man who has understood something too late and is going to spend the time he has left making it matter. She looked back. It was enough. The years that followed were not simple. Nothing that involves 23 years of distance and pride and pain becomes simple when the distance is crossed. Thomas and Richard met for the first time 6 weeks after the wedding. Thomas, who was recovering slowly but genuinely from his illness, sat across from Richard in the small living room of the house he and Catherine had made their home and asked him 3 questions. The first was about the argument. Richard answered it honestly. He said, "I thought I was protecting Catherine from a choice I believed was financially unwise. I was wrong. What I was actually doing was imposing my framework on her life because I couldn't understand a choice that was different from the ones I would have made." Thomas said, "And now?" Richard said, "Now I understand that the choice she made gave her a life that my money couldn't have improved. Only I could have improved it by not withdrawing." Thomas was quiet. Then he said, "She missed you. She was very careful about saying it because she is a careful person, but she missed you." Richard said, "I know." The second question was about Maya. Thomas asked what Richard intended. Richard said, "I intend to be her uncle if she will have me. I intend to be involved in her life the way an uncle should be involved, which I understand I will need to learn how to do since I have no practice." Thomas said, "She has already told 3 children at school that she has a billionaire uncle." Richard looked at him. Thomas said, "She is 7. She found out you were a billionaire and she found it interesting." Richard said, "Is that a problem?" Thomas said, "No, she has also told them that you are going to learn about birds." A pause. Richard said, "I found a book." Thomas said, "Which one?" Richard told him. Thomas, who had spent 15 years knowing every bird that came to his garden feeder, said, "That is a good one." They talked about birds for 20 minutes. The third question was the one Thomas had been building toward. He said, "Do you understand now what it is worth?" Richard said, "What specifically?" Thomas said, "A person who chooses you over everything else every day. Not because the situation is comfortable or because it is financially correct, because you are the person they would choose in every version of any situation." Richard was quiet. Thomas said, "Catherine has chosen me every day for 23 years, including the difficult ones, including the ones where she was tired and the money was thin and the illness made everything harder. Chose me on every one of those days and I chose her." He looked at Richard. He said, "That is worth more than you can calculate. I'm not saying this to make you feel bad about the choices you have made. I am saying it because you asked what I have built, and that is what I have built. That is what I have." Richard looked at this man across the small living room. He said, Catherine said, "You don't hold grudges." Thomas said, "I don't have time, neither does anyone else. They just don't all know it yet." Richard looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to be your brother-in-law properly if that is available." Thomas said, "I suppose it depends on the birds." Richard said, "I have the book." Thomas said, "Then we can probably work something out." Alina changed. Not immediately, not completely. Change that real does not happen immediately or completely, but she changed in the specific direction of someone who has had a mirror held up at a moment when they were not able to look away. She went to see Catherine 3 weeks after the wedding without Marcus, without preparation, without arrangement. She drove to the town and she found the house and she knocked on the door. Catherine answered. They stood at the door for a moment. Then Catherine said, "Come in." They talked for 3 hours about the morning at the wedding, about what Alina had said and why, about what it was like to grow up with everything, about what it was like to grow up without, about the specific distance between those 2 experiences and what happened when they met in a corridor with a basket of flower petals between them. Alina cried during the conversation, not the managed tears of someone performing emotion, the other kind. The kind that comes from genuinely understanding something that cannot be unfelt once felt. Catherine said at one point, "I am not asking you to feel guilty about having money. That is not what this is." Alina said, "What is it?" Catherine said, "I am asking you to notice that the people around you who have less than you are still people. That is all, Just notice them the way you notice people who have the same as you. Alina said, I thought I did. Catherine said, I know you thought so. Alina was quiet. Then she said, Mia, can I see her? Catherine looked at her. Then she called into the house. Maya came down the stairs with a bird book in her hands that Richard had sent 2 weeks before. She stopped when she saw Alina. They looked at each other. Then Maya said, Are you still getting married? Alina said, I am. We had the ceremony. Maya said, My mom said it went well. Alina said, Yes. After the beginning, Maya considered this. She said, Your dress was very pretty. Alina said, Thank you. A pause. Maya said, Mine was too. My mom pressed it twice. Alina looked at her. She said, I know. I'm sorry about what I said about that. Maya considered whether this was an acceptable response for another moment. Then she nodded, the specific nod of a child who has made a decision. She said, Do you want to see the bird book? My uncle sent it. He is learning birds. Alina looked at the book in Maya's hands. She said, Yes, I would like that. She sat on the stairs in Catherine's house with a 7-year-old child and a bird book between them, and they went through it page by page. And Maya told her the names of the birds that came to the garden feeder, and Alina listened to all of it. The locket, it had started the whole thing. The worn silver heart that had fallen to the floor and scattered petals, and brought Richard across the hall, and put everyone in a library together, and started the conversation that had to happen. Catherine wore it for the rest of her life. Not every day on the days that mattered, the day Thomas's illness went into full remission, the day Ma started at the new school, the day Richard came for Christmas for the first time since before Alina was born. Maya asked about it once when she was older. She was 12 by then and had the specific 12-year-old quality of wanting to understand the stories behind things rather than just accepting them. She said, Mom, what is the locket actually for? Catherine looked at her. She said, It is for remembering that things are connected. People are connected even when they seem separate. Maya said, Like you and Uncle Richard. Catherine said, Exactly like that. Maya said, Even for 23 years you were still connected. Catherine said, Yes, we just forgot to look at the connection for a while. Maya looked at the locket. She said, I think it is good that I dropped it. Catherine said, What do you mean? Maya said, At the wedding when it fell on the floor, if it hadn't fallen, he wouldn't have seen it. Catherine was quiet. She said, Yes, that is true. Maya said, So sometimes things falling is good. Catherine looked at her daughter. She said, Sometimes things falling is exactly what needs to happen. Maya nodded. She said, Can I wear it to school tomorrow? Catherine said, Yes, take care of the clasp. Maya said, I know, I always do. She went upstairs. Catherine sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the specific quiet of an evening that had come a long way from where it started. She thought about the corridor at the wedding venue, the scattered petals, the locket on the cold floor, the expression on Richard's face when he picked it up and opened it and understood what he was looking at. She thought about how close it had come to not happening. How if she had taken a different shift? How if Maya had not been chosen as a flower girl? How if the clasp had held? She thought about all the versions of the day in which none of it happened. In which she went home with the income she had earned, and Richard walked Alina down the aisle, and the silence continued for another 23 years, or for the rest of both their lives. She thought about how thin the line was. And then she thought about Mia at the top of the stairs with the bird book, showing Alina the names of the birds that came to the garden, and the specific expression on Alina's face as she listened, and how something can begin in the worst possible way and arrive somewhere that none of the people involved could have predicted. She finished her tea. She went upstairs. The house was full of the quiet of people who had enough of everything that mattered. That is the story. A bride who was cruel to a small girl at a wedding. A locket that fell to the floor. A photograph inside it that changed everything about that day. But what I want to say before we end is something simple. The locket did not create the connection between Richard and Catherine. The connection was already there. It had been there for 23 years of silence. What the locket did was make it visible in a moment when Richard had no choice but to see it. And Alina is not the villain of this story. She is the product of a specific kind of upbringing, one where everything was given and nothing was felt to cost. What happened at the wedding was not a sudden cruelty from someone who had always been cruel. It was the visible result of something that had been building without anyone noticing that it needed to be addressed. Richard understood this. The hardest thing he said in that library was not what he said to Catherine. It was what he said to Elena. This is what a life of having everything without understanding cost produces. He said it because he loved her too much not to say it. That is what real love does. It says the hard, true thing at the moment when it is hardest to say and most necessary to hear. The flower girl with the wrong dress in the corridor. The locket that fell, the photograph inside. None of it was planned. None of it was arranged. It happened the way the most important things happen. In the middle of an ordinary day, out of a small accident, producing consequences that none of the people in the corridor could have predicted when the petals scattered across the floor. Pay attention to what falls. Sometimes it falls for a reason. This has been Tribal Tales Hub. If this story moved you, if the locket moment or the library conversation or mayor with the bird book hit something real in your chest, hit that like button right now. 1 second. That is how you tell us this is what you want more of. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub and turn on the notification bell. We are here every week with a story like this one. A story about people who were lost and found. About connections that held through silence. About the specific moment when something falls and everything changes. Share this video with someone who needs it. You know who that person is. The one who has a silence in their life that has gone on too long. The one who knows where the distance started but has not yet made the first move to cross it. Send this to them and drop a comment below. Tell us, is there a silence in your life that needs a locket to fall? Tell us. We read every comment. This is Tribal Tales Hub. The things that fall sometimes fall exactly right. We will see you in the next story.